Today at 6, the government strikes a deal with France to try to reduce the number of migrants crossing the Channel, but admits it won't solve the problem. More arrived today, over 40,000 so far this year.
On its own, this agreement will not fix the problem. It's important that everyone is clear about that.
British border officials will observe their counterparts in France, and more French police will patrol the beaches. Also tonight, at the trial of nurse Lucy Letby, a mother tells of the moment she claims she saw Letby trying to kill her baby. The Ukrainian anthem plays in Kherson as President Zelensky visits the recaptured city for the first time. And one of the greatest ever footballers, but this time Ronaldo's opponent is his own club.
On BBC London, hospitality workers call for more support for their restaurants, hotels, pubs and cafes amid soaring costs and staff shortages.
Good evening and welcome to the BBC News at 6. The UK and France have struck a deal to try to reduce the number of migrants crossing the Channel in small boats. It will mean UK border force officials will be able to observe their French counterparts in control rooms and on beaches. And the number of officers patrolling the French coast will rise from 200 to 300, costing the UK government an additional £8 million a year on top of the current deal, costing £55 million. The number of migrants who've crossed the Channel in small boats this year topped 40,000 at the weekend, which is a steep increase on the 28,000 last year. And then back in 2018, only 300 people made the crossing, when far more came in lorries. The deal has been criticised by refugee agencies and by the Conservative MP for Dover. Their Home Secretary is describing it as a step forward rather than something that will fix the problem. Our Home Editor, Mark Eason, is in Dover for us this evening. And Mark, is there any sense of how much difference this deal will make, if any?
Well, as you heard, the Home Secretary playing down the impact of this agreement with France, and probably wisely, because the asylum problem crisis is about more than a standoff between migrants and police on the beaches of northern France. And we've had a weekend with a lot of migrant activity, and it's been another very busy day in Dover Port behind me. Around 2,000 migrants have arrived on the Kent coast in the last few days, each individual brought ashore, adding to the pressure on an already under fire Home Secretary to get a grip on what she describes as a migration crisis. As Dover greeted migrant rescue boats, Suella Braverman was in Paris for an early morning signing ceremony with her French counterpart. In her pocket, more money to pay more gendarmes to patrol the Calais beaches, and an agreement on closer cooperation. But hold on, Sandhurst? That sign rings a bell. The Sandhurst Treaty was the UK-French security deal signed by Prime Minister Theresa May and President Emmanuel Macron back in 2018. In fact, there have been quite a few deals, each promising to stop small boats leaving the Channel coastline. In 2018, the UK handed over £45 million for improved security in France, and that was on top of £100 million spent in the previous 3 years. And then in 2019, another £3 million, in 2020, £27 million, and then in 2021, £55 million. And today, £63 million in the latest deal. So will it make any difference?
In order to solve the problem of illegal migration on the Channel, we take a multi-dimensional approach. There's no single answer, there's no quick fix, there's no silver bullet.
The hope is that embedding UK border force observers in the French control centre will make it easier to disrupt attempts to cross the Channel, like this one filmed yesterday by a French fisherman. Dover's MP, though, doesn't think the deal is good enough.
Well, I think this new French agreement unfortunately falls short of the type of action that we need to tackle the small boats crisis. It is an absolutely urgent situation. We do need to see those boats stopped before they leave France.
This morning's arrivals were loaded onto coaches for the 20-mile journey to the processing centre at Manston. Recently criticised by inspectors for wretched conditions, including overcrowding and disease, the Home Office wouldn't say whether the numbers at Manston today remain within legal limits.
This has been going on a very, very long time, and the Home Secretary has said that the asylum system is broken. She's right about that. They broke it. So yes, this is a step in the right direction, but there's so much more that needs to be done.
As things stand, the most effective tool to stop asylum seekers risking their lives to reach the UK is not gendarme, night vision equipment or embedded border force officers. It is the weather. If the seas remain calm enough for the smugglers to operate, thousands more will make the perilous journey. Mark Easton, BBC News, Dover.
Our correspondent Lucy Williamson is in Calais for us. So, Lucy, what's the view of the deal from there?
Well, more resources, more patrols, more equipment is always welcome, but as you've heard, that's never going to be the whole solution. And that's partly because of the kind of geography that we're dealing with here. The last patrol I was out on, the commander said, look, thanks to the UK, we have the drones to spot the smugglers. We have the vehicles to get across the dunes to them quickly. But they often hide their boats inside thickets of really thorny, tough scrub that sometimes comes up to the waist, comes up to the chest. It rips through uniforms, it rips through skin, and that's never going to be a quick or stealthy approach. So I think there are people here who are quite pleased there are going to be British officers observing what they do here on French soil, because they think it might make it easier to explain some of those challenges. Certainly a good sign for political ties, warmer relations after years of tensions. But there are some more cynical attitudes as well. One official at the town hall here privately suggested to me that having British officers here, even just as observers, would make it much harder for the UK to point the finger of blame at France.
Lucy Williamson in Calais, thank you. A court has been hearing emotional evidence from the mother of a baby boy who's alleged to have been murdered by a nurse in Chester. The woman, who can't be named for legal reasons, is said to have walked into the room as the prosecution say Lucy Letby's attack on her son was in progress. Our North of England correspondent Judith Moritz reports, and you may find some of her report upsetting.
These incubators were supposed to be the safest possible environment for the premature twin boys who were in them in the summer of 2015. But it's alleged that within 24 hours, one was murdered here and an attempt was made to kill the other. The prosecution say that their nurse, Lucy Letby, injected the older twin, known as Baby E, with air into his bloodstream. The twins' mother was on the postnatal ward recovering from giving birth. One evening, she went to drop off some breast milk for her son's feed. She said that as she approached the room, she could hear her son crying, and it was unlike anything she'd ever heard before. She said it was not a sound that should come from a tiny baby. It was horrendous, more of a scream than a cry. The mother said she panicked because she felt there was something wrong. Lucy Letby was the only person in the room. She was standing by the nurse's workstation, not by the incubator. The mother said that when she reached the incubator, she saw blood around Baby E's mouth, and that Nurse Letby had told her it was because the baby's feeding tube had rubbed his throat, an explanation she accepted, though she was concerned by it. Prosecuting Nick Johnson Casey asked the twins' mother, "Did Lucy Letby say anything else to you?" "She told me to go back to the ward," said the mother. "Why did you do what you were told?" she was asked. "Because she was an authority," she said, "and she knew better than me, and I trusted her. Completely." The jury's been told that Baby E died in the early hours of the next morning, and afterwards Nurse Letby bathed him. Later that night, she and a colleague exchanged text messages about what had happened. Lucy Letby said it was just awful because Baby E was bleeding from everywhere during resus. Parents distraught. "I feel numb." Her colleague said, "You seem to be having some very bad luck." To which Lucy Letby replied, "Not a lot I can do, really. He had a massive hemorrhage. Could have happened to any baby." It's alleged that Lucy Letby tried to murder Baby E's twin brother the following day. She denies all of the charges she faces against a total of 17 babies. Judith Moritz, BBC News, Manchester.
The Ukrainian president has been visiting the city of Kherson days after it was recaptured following the withdrawal of Russian forces. Addressing troops in the city's main square, Volodymyr Zelensky said step by step they are reclaiming the country's invaded territories. The recapture of the city is a strategic setback for Moscow because it was the only regional capital to fall into Russian hands after it invaded Ukraine in February. 30,000 Russian troops have retreated east of the city across the Dnipro River, where they're preparing positions that they can more easily defend. In Kherson today, President Zelensky praised the Ukrainian army, saying it had done a great job and the country was moving forwards. Our correspondent James Waterhouse was there.
After everything Kherson's main square has seen, today was more than just a change in the wind. Until just weeks ago, the sight of Ukraine's leader here would have been difficult to imagine. This regional capital is back in its control. He was asked whether it was the beginning of the end of this war.
We are going forward. We are ready for peace, but our peace for our country is all our country, all our territory. We respect the law and respect sovereignty of all the countries, but now we are speaking about our countries.
An undeniable moment in this war. President Zelensky appearing in the heart of Kherson. That was thought to be in firm Russian control. He has described this as the beginning of the end of the war, and few people here will disagree with that.
Ukraine's leader knows there's a lot of fighting and negotiating before that point. For now, Kherson feels like a city emerging from its own lockdown. One place which didn't shut was this grocery shop, run by Valentina and Valentina. We're not sure if it's better because we're just simple people, she says. The most important thing is that we're still alive.
So this is a Russian brand of wafer biscuit.
It's kind of a strange legacy of occupation where Valentina's shop is full of stock from Russia. At one point they were forced to accept the Russian ruble, but no more.
They usually paid, but they still carried weapons, which was very scary. My knees were shaking from fear, but I had to keep working. It was so hard. Even now I want to cry.
Some Russian traces are more obvious than others. This used to be the headquarters used by Moscow-installed politicians. It's claimed some people were tortured here if they didn't follow the rules. Ukraine is desperate to achieve peace on its own terms. It is still the underdog, but what's got it this far is knowing what it's fighting for. James Waterhouse, BBC News, Kherson.
President Biden has met China's leader Xi Jinping for the first time since taking office. The two men held 3 hours of talks on the sidelines of the G20 summit in Bali. China's claims to Taiwan were discussed and remain a point of friction. But the two men also agreed to strengthen cooperation on global issues such as climate change. Well, let's speak to Barbara Plettascher, who's in Washington for us this evening. Barbara, how significant was this meeting today?
You know, this is one of those meetings that's significant because it happened, not because of what was achieved. The two men actually know each other quite well because they spent a lot of time together when they were vice presidents. But a lot has changed since then, and this is their first in-person meeting since they took leadership of their countries, with relations at an all-time low. Some are even talking about a new Cold War confrontation. What Mr. Biden had said he was looking for from this meeting was blunt talk on priorities and interests, and it looks as if he got that. They talked about all the issues dividing them: the economy, trade, human rights, different approaches to Ukraine, and of course the most contentious, which is Taiwan, which China sees as a renegade province that should rejoin the mainland. Mr. Biden repeated that U.S. policy hadn't changed, even though he has suggested several times that the Americans would come to Taiwan's defense if China attacked. Xi Jinping repeated that this was a red line that the Americans had better not cross. But both leaders signaled pretty strongly that they want to manage this relationship, that they want to keep up the conversation, and that now the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, will be traveling to China to continue the discussion.
Barbara in Washington, thank you. On Thursday, the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, will announce his autumn statement. He's warned that we'll all be paying more tax and that some of the cuts required are eye-watering. Tens of billions of pounds are set to be clawed back, but exactly how to do that while trying to grow the economy at the same time isn't easy. Our economics editor Faisal Islam is here. So Faisal, what are some of the key issues facing the government?
Well, thanks, Fiona. This is a very unusual Chancellor's statement, a type of rescue budget after a massive energy shock. This is how big. In 2019, the UK as a whole, that's households, companies and government, spent about £40 billion on its energy bill. This year, that's up fourfold to 190 billion. That increase is basically like having to fund another NHS. That cost can't be shouldered by households, and it's the government's job to share the pain around. Pain the Prime Minister acknowledges has also been made worse by his predecessor.
On the steps of Downing Street, I said that mistakes had been made. A part of the reason that I became Prime Minister was to address them. And what we've seen now is that stability has returned to the United Kingdom. But that's because the expectation is that the government will make those difficult but necessary decisions.
And those difficult decisions are likely to include significant spending cuts. Take infrastructure investment. Some things like buildings, roads and railways set to be pushed back. A potentially easy way for the Treasury to find savings, and if cut back closer to sort of £50 billion rather than the £70 billion year it's been, that's many billions in savings while still leaving spending well above the average of the previous Labour government, for example. But the government's own infrastructure czar told me that priorities such as levelling up were at risk from flip-flopping over investment like this.
Well, it is very important for levelling up, and particularly in the Midlands and the North, and therefore I would hope that we will not see things like the integrated rail plan being shelved, or indeed HS2, because I think they can play a vital part in levelling up.
Then there are tax rises of a sort. A significant widening of the net is expected. Over most of the past decade and a half, the number of UK taxpayers has remained remarkably constant, around 31 million. Within that, the number paying the higher rate has been around 4 million. This has been by design, the result since 2010 of Conservative policy to up thresholds, the point at which these bands of tax start, significantly. But now that's in total reverse, with the new policy to freeze those bands for years. As a result, the total number of taxpayers is heading up to 35 million by 2026, maybe 36 million if extended again on Thursday. Meanwhile, the number of higher rate taxpayers, well, that could double to well over 8 million by 2028. The end result on Thursday, lots more tax revenue from a much wider tax net of taxpayers. So tough decisions on spending and tax, some pushed into the future past 2025, and acknowledgement of the balancing act between credibly making numbers add up and not worsening the immediate recession. Fiona.
Faisal, thank you. And over the course of the week, there'll be lots more information on the autumn statement on the BBC website. You can find out more about what's likely to be announced on Thursday at bbc.co.uk/news, and, of course, by using the BBC News app. The time is 18 minutes past 6. Our top story this evening. The government strikes a deal with France to try to reduce the number of migrants crossing the Channel, but admits it won't solve the problem.
Hello, Marconi House, London, calling.
And still to come, 100 years since the first official BBC broadcast, a radio news bulletin.
And on BBC London, can anything be done to deal with London's soaring rental prices? A summit's been held to find out. And young musicians who fled the war in Ukraine prepare to play a night at the Proms.
The global population is projected to hit a new all-time high tomorrow, reaching the landmark figure of 8 billion people, according to the United Nations. The world's population has doubled in less than 50 years and is set to keep rising. Our medical editor Fergus Welsh has been examining the figures and what they mean for us all.
Our planet has never held so many people as the era of huge population growth continues. Back in 1800, there were around 1 billion people on Earth, and it took over a century for that to double. Then it really took off in the 20th century, reaching 3 billion in 1960 and putting on nearly 1 billion each decade after that. It reached 7 billion in 2011. We're now set to hit 8 billion people on the planet. So what about the future? The UN projects there'll be 9 billion people by around 2037 and 10 billion by 2058. Global population could peak at around 10.4 billion in the 2080s and then plateau before declining in the next century. The United Nations says more than half the projected population increase to 2050 will be in just 8 countries. Half of them are in sub-Saharan Africa. Indeed, the total population of this entire region is set to almost double to 2 billion by 2050. Remember, it includes some of the world's least developed countries, many already experiencing food insecurity. India and China are the world's most populous countries. Both are home to more than 1.4 billion people. But India will overtake China next year. China's population, along with scores of other countries, is set to fall sharply later this century. Now that's because global fertility is declining dramatically. Back in 1950, women gave birth on average to 5 children. That has since more than halved to 2.3 births, and it's set to fall even further. But there are so many people of childbearing age now, that explains why the global population will keep rising for much of this century. Another reason is we're living longer. Average global life expectancy reached almost 73 years in 2019, up almost 9 years since 1990. COVID actually pushed it down by nearly 2 years, but it's projected to keep rising. The world's population is also ageing. About 1 in 10 people on the planet is now 65 or older. By 2050, it'll be almost 1 in 6, so that will put a greater burden on the young. Our growing population also puts increasing pressure on resources, food, water, energy, as well as infrastructure. Huge issues for society with lasting implications for our planet.
Fergus Walsh reporting there. The head of Gwent Police says any officers found to be sharing abhorrent messages could face criminal action. It follows reports that shocking sexist and racist content was found on devices belonging to a former officer. The Chief Constable has been meeting a group of MPs and Senedd members to discuss the investigation. Our Wales correspondent Hywel Griffith is outside Gwent Police headquarters. Hywel.
Yes, these messages were found on the phone and a tablet belonging to an officer who served at Gwent Police for over a quarter of a century before he died 2 years ago. Now, a solicitor for his family says they found these conversations between him and other officers which discussed sexual harassment of colleagues and included sexist, racist and homophobic abuse, as well as, they say, evidence of corruption. Now, there's an independent investigation into the matter, but after reports in the Sunday Times yesterday, well, the Chief Constable here at Gwent Police has spent the afternoon meeting local MPs and Senedd members to hear their concerns. One politician who was at the meeting has told the BBC they do feel reassured that this force is trying to change its culture. However, it is only 2 months since 2 senior officers here were sacked for inappropriately touching a junior officer at a work event. So there are some who say the events here and issues at the Met Police now should trigger a wider public inquiry into police behaviour. But we'll wait to see what the independent investigation brings. The person speaking on behalf of that officer's family say, however, they have already lost trust in the police and they want to see these issues being brought to the wider public.
Hywel Griffith, thank you. The clothing group Joules has announced it's calling in administrators after failing to secure emergency investment, putting around 1,600 jobs at risk. The Leicestershire-based company started out selling colourful clothes at country shows before growing to over 130 high street shops. Its founder, Tom Jewell, says he hopes restructuring the business model could enable the brand to survive on a smaller scale. He's one of the greatest footballers ever to have played the game. But this time, Cristiano Ronaldo's opponent is his own club. He's launched an extraordinary attack on Manchester United, saying he feels betrayed by the club and that it's trying to force him out. He was speaking on Talk TV. Our sports correspondent, Joe Wilson, reports.
Think of a footballer more famous than Cristiano Ronaldo? Well, perhaps you can't. He returned to Manchester United last season, but the club's latest manager, Erik ten Hag, is building his team around others. Ronaldo feels betrayal.
People should listen to the truth. Yes, I feel betrayed, and I felt that some people that don't want me here, not only this year, but last year too.
Cristiano Ronaldo was originally signed by Sir Alex Ferguson nearly 20 years ago, glory days. Ronaldo now believes that United are stuck in the past.
since the Sir Alex Ferguson left, I saw not evolution in the club. The progress was zero. Nothing changed. Surprisingly, not only the pool, the jacuzzi, even the gym. They stop in a time which it surprised me a lot.
Naturally, all this is the talk of football, for example, on the BBC's Match of the Day 2.
Whether he feels lied to or not, today just don't feel right to me. It feels. I don't think it's going to help him with the Manchester United.
I think it's disappointing, to be honest. I mean, he's got nothing to prove. So I can't understand why he would want to put his point across. Maybe his ego's dented a little bit.
Well, what do United supporters make of Ronaldo's comments?
It doesn't look good for, obviously, his relations with the club. And I don't think you'll probably see him playing again.
No player is above, the manager's decisions at the end of the day, not even someone of Ronaldo's scale.
We back Ronaldo, don't we? He's a massive player, isn't he? So I think, and like the fans, they just love Ronaldo, don't they? Like the kids especially, they look up to Ronaldo.
Ultimately, all players, even him, will be replaced. Joe Wilson, BBC News.
The King is celebrating his 74th birthday today, his first as monarch. To mark the occasion, a portrait showing him standing beside an ancient oak tree in Windsor has been released. There are no public engagements planned. He's expected to mark the day privately. But there was this. The Royal Guards played Happy Birthday for the King at Buckingham Palace. Now, can you solve a Rubik's Cube? George Scully, a so-called speed cubing champion, has set a new world record by solving the puzzle 6,931 times in the space of 24 hours. His average speed per cube is 12 seconds, but he can do it in nearly half that time. So here's George on the news channel earlier. Watch and marvel. The BBC is celebrating the 100th anniversary of its first official BBC broadcast, a radio news bulletin from London, and the presenter would have talked into a microphone a bit like this one, though this is later, from the early 1940s. That first broadcast included a report on a court proceedings at the Old Bailey, details of disruption caused by fog in the capital, and the billiard scores. Our correspondent David Sillitoe has more.
Hello. 2LO calling. 2LO calling.
November the 14th, 1922, and the beginning of the BBC. 2LO was the call sign of the BBC station in London. And 100 years on, the 6 o'clock radio news has been marking how it all began.
This bulletin marks the moment 100 years ago that the BBC began broadcasting.
Back in 1922, the newsreader at 6 p.m. was Arthur Burrows.
Arthur Burrows, at this point, is the first voice of the BBC. He's almost had the idea of broadcasting a few years earlier as well. And within a month, he will be director of programmes at the BBC and one of our first children's presenters.
Yes, Arthur was also Uncle Arthur, children's entertainer. It wasn't a large organisation on day one. How many staff at the beginning in November 1922?
November 1922, the BBC has a staff of 0. There are no employees.
No official staff?
There are no official staff. Arthur Burrows does that first broadcast essentially in his spare time.
Was it just London in November 1922?
No, London was day one, and then day two was Birmingham and Manchester. And that's where you get musical concerts, children's programmes come in there, the general election results as well, all mixed in together.
For them as likes London, I suppose it's all right.
And the BBC has only now been discovering just how many of its pioneering programmes came from Manchester and Birmingham.
Wherever to you, Birmingham.
It's adding details to its online Radio Times history about satire, concerts. And this is Puppy from the children's programme from Glasgow. But it began with the news, and it was nerve-wracking. Arthur Burrows later wrote he could think of no more exacting a test of physical fitness than the reading of a news bulletin. David Sillitoe, BBC News.
I think you might have been overstating it a little bit, but I know someone who is fit as a flea, and that is Louise Lear. Louise, tell us about the weather.
I don't think so. Running around all the time. I tell you what, 100 years ago we had fog in London, and look at this. It's almost as though we planned it. Yes, it's been a foggy day. A real November morning this morning, wasn't it? Grey and gloomy for many of us. Really quite damp out there as well with that fog. So this was actually across parts of Doncaster, but most of central and eastern England had some low cloud and fog, which some lingered all day, but we did get to see some sunshine. There hasn't been much, but nevertheless, a glorious end to the afternoon imbued in Cornwall. Let's take a look at the satellite picture, see where the best of the sunny breaks were. Actually, not a bad day in East Anglia today, and eventually into the southwest. This slightly greyer zone, that was the fog that lingered all day. And yes, there's been some rain around, so a little bit of everything, a real autumn day for many. The rain has been quite light and patchy across southwest England and Wales, the heaviest of which is into the far northwest, but there's some rain proper. It's coming, it's arriving through the night tonight, wet and windy tomorrow, a real change to the story as we go through tomorrow and perhaps Wednesday into Thursday as well. So yes, we've got this light patchy rain, but it's almost going to get eaten up by this beast that's moving in from the west. So some very wet and increasingly windy weather starting to move in. Where we've got the clearer skies, we might see single figures here. But first thing tomorrow morning, some of that rain really quite heavy. The brighter greens denoting the intensity. So across that south coast, moving up through the Midlands, up into the northwest, gradually drifting its way to northeast England and eastern Scotland by the end of the afternoon. It will brighten up for some. It's going to be a windy afternoon as well, with some sharp showers into the southwest. But look at these gusts of winds. We're looking at about 35 to 45 miles an hour, maybe stronger across the Northern Isles later on in the day as that rain pushes through. In terms of the feel of the weather, 11 to 13 degrees. This is where it should be for this time of year, but it'll probably feel quite a shock to the system as we've not seen some wetter weather. So lots of weather fronts will then start to move in from the Atlantic as we go through the week ahead. Best day of the week, Friday. Make a note, that's the day you want to be out and about because it's wet and windy for most of us, I'm afraid, for the next few days to come. Fiona.
Louise, thanks very much. And that is it from the BBC News at 6. The news continues here on BBC One, of course, as now it's time to join our colleagues across the nations and regions for the news where you are. From us, bye-bye.